thing that I have thought about as I move through these letters, especially as we talk about a church like the Church of Philadelphia, in spite of everything that they had going for them, at some point, and I don't know when, and I don't have all the information, but at some point, they died. And there's not a church, a faithful congregation of the Lord, as far as we know, there in Philadelphia. I don't even know if it's still, I should look that up, I guess. I don't even know if it's still called Philadelphia. Now it's part of Turkey. And I suspect they changed the name, but I don't know. I should look that up. I don't know for sure. I think about, for example, the church at Antioch and all the great things that happened there. It's possible that, I shouldn't say that. The gospel would have made its way into Europe and around the world, even if it hadn't been to the church at Antioch. God would have had some other way to accomplish that. But the church at Antioch is the ones that sent out Paul and Barnabas on what we call Paul's first missionary journey. And then it was on his second missionary journey that he went to Philippi and Thessalonica and Berea and Corinth and Athens, and from there it spread even further into Europe. So they were instrumental in evangelizing vast parts of the world at that time. And yet, there's not a church at Antioch today. Like the church at Philadelphia, at some point that church died. And as much as we don't like to think about it, and as much as we may not be able to imagine it, with everything that's positive for this church right here, we're only ever really one generation away from ceasing to exist. And I think that's part of what Jesus wanted the church at Philadelphia to understand. Don't let up. Don't stop growing. Don't stop doing everything you can to help the church and to grow the church. And that's something that every church needs, really, but even the church right here. We've got to, that's got to sink in. There's a sense of urgency. Just because it seems like, we got a pretty good crowd this morning. There's a few empty seats, but not many. But don't let that lead to complacency and apathy, because you got to keep growing. You got to keep pushing. That's really the message here to the church. So Jesus begins by referring to himself as the one who is holy and true. And I've talked about this in the past. Most of the time, when Jesus addresses himself, when he introduces himself to whatever church he's writing to, he refers back to something that John saw in chapter 1. If you remember in chapter 1, John talks about how he's exiled on the Isle of Patmos. He says he was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and he heard a voice. And he didn't know how to really describe that voice. So first he says, it sounded like a trumpet. And this is one of the passages that helps me to know that Revelation is different than most of the rest of the Bible, because it's using figurative language. John doesn't want us to think that he heard an actual trumpet, but the voice that he heard is so loud and so distinct, he can't think of a better way to describe it than it sounded like a trumpet. Later on in the same chapter, he talks about how this voice sounded like the rushing of many waters. And again, he didn't hear an actual waterfall or an actual downpour. He's trying to describe the way this voice sounded. Well, he turns and he looks to see who it is that's talking to him, and he sees this figure, which of course we know is Jesus. And he's dressed all in white, almost to the point that he's glowing. In fact, John talks about how he is as radiant as the sun. He has eyes like fire. He has a sword coming out of his mouth. And he just goes on to describe this picture of Jesus. And most of the time, in the letters that Jesus writes to the 7 churches, he uses some part of that image to describe himself. But it's different with the church of Philadelphia. He doesn't refer to any of those physical things. He first says he's the one who is holy and true. Now that does in a way refer back to that image, because I think part of what that image that John sees is symbolizing is the fact that Jesus is holy and true. That's why he's glowing and dressed in white. That's what that's intended to portray. And of course, in many of the letters, one of the things Jesus promises to those who overcome is that we'll be dressed like him. And so that's kind of part of that image too. We get to be holy and true through Jesus. Jesus is the only one that is completely holy and true. He's the holiest, he's the truest. But through him, we as his people also can be holy and true. Then he talks about how he has the key of David. Now, again, this is figurative. He's not talking about a literal key, but a key signifies access. It opens doors. It unlocks locks. You know, Jesus told Peter in Matthew chapter 16, after Peter made that good confession, he says, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God," and Jesus promises him that he's going to give him the keys to the kingdom. And obviously what that means is that Peter is going to be able to give access to the kingdom. And now a lot of people take that, and you know, I don't know how many jokes I've heard that have something to do with Peter standing at the pearly gates, either welcoming people in or denying them access. But that's not what Jesus meant. What gives access today to the kingdom is the gospel. And when Jesus told Peter that he was going to give him the keys of the kingdom, he meant that you're going to be the one that's able to open the door and let people into the kingdom. And he did that on the day of Pentecost when he preached what we call the first gospel sermon. He told people how they could enter the kingdom. He gave them access through that sermon. And he does the same thing in Acts chapter 10 to the household of Cornelius. And that wasn't just to the household of Cornelius. That was intended to let people know that the door was open to everybody. Not just Jews, like in Acts chapter 2, but to the whole world, everybody else. And so that's what Jesus meant when he told Peter that he was going to give him the keys to the kingdom. He was the one who was going to give people access to the kingdom. Now, Jesus, when he says he has the key of David, that's pretty much what he's talking about too. David was the king. David is the one that the Jews would have recognized as king. And so that's what Jesus is saying. He's saying, I'm the king. I am the one who has the power and the authority to give access or to deny access to the kingdom. He says, and I think this is him explaining what he meant when he said, I have the key of David. He says, I'm the one who opens and no one shuts. He's saying, I'm the one that has the authority. If I want to grant access, if I want to open the door, it's open. Nobody can shut it. On the other hand, if I want to deny access, if I choose to shut the door, nobody can open it. If you want into the kingdom, you've got to go through me. That's what he's saying. And of course, that's in keeping with many other passages that you can find in the gospel, especially the writings of John, who was also writing the book of Revelation. One of the things that I think about when I think about this door being open or shut, I think about the ark. I think about Noah's ark. And there's a lot of speculation. People talk a lot about how the people reacted when Noah was building the ark and so on and so forth. We don't really know. That's just speculation. Now, is it possible that people laughed and made fun of Noah? Absolutely. But the Bible doesn't really give us that information. But one of the things that I do know is that there was a time when the door to the ark was open. When God caused the animals to migrate to Noah's ark and to get on. That's another thing people like to make fun of. How did Noah round up all these animals? Well, I don't believe he had to. I believe God just made it happen. What makes the ducks and the geese migrate from Canada down to here or even further south? Well, you can get all kinds of explanations for that, but ultimately, God's the one that gave them that ability. And I think that's the same sort of way how he rounded up the animals and got them to get on the ark. Anyway, that's really a side point. But that door was open. But when God told Noah and his family to come into the ark, before the rain started falling, that door was shut. And there wasn't anybody getting in or out at that point. If you were on the inside, you were safe. If you were on the outside, you were condemned. That's kind of what Jesus is talking about. There's a time when the door is open. There's going to be a time when the door is shut. And then he tells the church at Philadelphia, just like he told the other 7 churches, I know your works. And he knows my works. And he knows your works. And I've talked about this time and time again. That's either comforting or it's scary. I don't know how it is for you. But it's either comforting because we know that he's going to judge us not based on what other people think about us, not based on our appearance, or how things might look to our family or those. He knows. On the other hand, maybe you're somebody that's got everybody fooled. Yeah, I don't know, and I'm not trying to get into anybody's business. The point is the Lord knows. And you can't fool him. Then he says, I have set before you an open door, and no one can shut it. And I think this is what Jesus would say to the world today. That's part of our mission as Christians, to evangelize. We want people to know the door is open. They can be saved. Nobody is too evil or too wicked or too whatever. Jesus died for you so that you could be saved. The door is open and no one can shut it. And that's what Jesus wants the church at Philadelphia to understand. It's what he wants us to understand. It's what he wants us to go out and tell the world. The door is open. They can be saved. Anyone can be saved. The door's open. But it's up to the individual whether or not they're going to walk through it, whether or not they're going to enter. Paul says in Romans chapter 8, verses 37 through 39, and there's a lot more that goes right along with this in Romans chapter 8, but I didn't want to read the whole chapter this morning. But in verses 37 through 39, he says, Yet in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am persuaded that neither death nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor powers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor height, nor depth, nor any other created thing shall be able to separate us from the love of God which is in Christ Jesus our Lord. Jesus says the door's open and nothing can shut it. That's what Paul's saying. Jesus died so that I could be saved. And not just so I could be saved, so I could be, as Paul says, more than a conqueror. Now, I don't know exactly what that means. What's more than a conqueror? Well, the point is, he's given us everything that we need. Not just to squeak by. Not just to barely get to heaven. But he's giving us everything we need to be successful in Christian life. To win. And to have an abundant entrance, as Peter talks about in 2 Peter chapter 1, into life everlasting, into the kingdom. The door is open and no one can shut it. However, Obviously, not everyone's going to be saved. Not everyone's going to overcome. So what makes the difference? Well, it's personal choice. It's personal commitment. Now, no one can go to heaven just because they choose to. No one can go to heaven just because they deserve to or they somehow earn it. It's through Jesus and his sacrifice. But there's still a choice on our part. Peter says in 2 Peter chapter 1, now I just referenced this as far as, well, let's just read it here. This is after he gives the Christian graces. We call it the Christian graces. He tells us some things that should be a part of our faith. He says, add to your faith virtue, and to virtue knowledge, and knowledge self-control, and so on and so forth. Then he says in verse 10 and 11, therefore, brethren, be even more diligent to make your call and election sure. Now, why would Peter tell us to be more diligent if it didn't matter? That's what a lot of people will say. God either chooses the Savior or he doesn't. What you do doesn't matter. Well, that doesn't make any sense. Peter says that you've got to be diligent. Be even more diligent to make your call and election sure. For if you do these things, you will never stumble. For so an entrance will be supplied to you abundantly into the everlasting kingdom of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Why will we receive this abundant entrance? Well, it's through Jesus. Obviously, Jesus is the only one that can open the door. Jesus is the reason why the door is open. But there are some things that God requires of me and of you to enter through that door. And that's some of the things Peter's talking about here in 2 Peter chapter 1. It takes diligence. It takes effort. But we can do it. And we can receive this abundant entrance. He tells them further in Revelation chapter 3, for you have a little strength, and have kept my word, and have not denied my name. Now, first of all, Jesus doesn't talk about their great strength, and I think that's significant. Jesus doesn't want them to think. He doesn't want them to get the impression. He doesn't want me, as the reader, to get the impression that the people of Philadelphia, that the Christians there at the church at Philadelphia are so good, are so strong in faith, that they somehow merit salvation. He says that their strength is only little. He wants them and us to understand that yes, there are some things that we are required to do, to give up, to sacrifice, but those things are just little. God's the one who takes care of the big things. God's the one that sent his son to die on the cross. Jesus is the one that opened the door. And then what the conditions that he puts on us to enter through that door are very small in comparison. He calls their strength little. You know, Paul talks about his thorn in the flesh. He talks about how he prayed 3 times to have that taken away. And the only response he got was, my grace is sufficient for you. And he goes on to talk about how that God's strength is revealed through man's weakness. That's kind of backwards to the way most people think. But God's strength is revealed through man's weakness. That's why the story of David and Goliath is so powerful. Nobody is going to try to argue that David was such a skilled warrior, that he was such a trained operator, I don't know what word to use, that he, of his own skill, defeated Goliath. Everybody understands that the only reason why David was successful that day is because the Lord was with him. And that's what Paul means when he says that God's strength is revealed through man's weakness. And I think that's what Jesus is referencing here when he describes the strength of the people of Philadelphia as little. Yes, there's some things that they had to do and that they still have to do, but those things are small in comparison with what God has done for us. He says, you've kept my word. Now, some people blow that out of proportion and act like that it's impossible to keep God's word. And I am not, it's hard sometimes. Temptation is real. The devil's real. All of us have sinned. I'm not, I get that it's hard. But the point is, it's not hard when you compare it to what he did for us. That's the context in which it's small. He says, you've kept my word and have not denied my name. That makes me think of Matthew 10:32. I've talked about this passage quite a bit through Revelation as well. We look at Matthew 10:32 where Jesus says that if we confess his name on earth, he'll confess our name in heaven. And we think about that. We talk about that in terms of baptism and how confession is necessary before someone's baptized. And I agree with that. I think all that's valid and important, but it's more than just that. And that's what Jesus is talking about here. When he says you've not denied my name, he doesn't mean that you're willing to stand up and confess my name before you were baptized in water for the remission of sins. He means that by your life, by the way that you live, and they're living in a pretty hard place. Philadelphia is a pretty wicked city. I'm not going to talk about how, all the different things we could talk about. But it's not, it's not some great utopia that they live in. They've got persecution there. They've got problems there. And yet, they have not denied Jesus. That's part of what he means when he says, you have a little strength, you've kept my word. They have not denied Jesus. Jesus says in John chapter 10, verses 9 and 10. And I think this is exactly what he's talking about to the church of Philadelphia. He says, I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved, and will go in and out and find pasture. The thief has not come except to steal and to kill and to destroy. I have come that they may have life, and that they may have it more abundantly. It's not of their own strength, but they do have a little strength. They do have a little bit of a part to play in their own salvation. Jesus came, he died to open the door, but there's something we must do. There's something that they must do to walk through it and to enter into the kingdom. He says in Revelation chapter 3, verse 9, indeed, I will make those of the synagogue of Satan, who say they are Jews and are not, but lie. Indeed, I will make them come and worship before your feet, and to know that I have loved you. Now, this is interesting. He talks about the synagogue of Satan when he wrote to the church at Pergamos. And I believe the church at Pergamos was the one that I don't know. I get them mixed up. But, one of the churches at least was the church that he talks a lot about them being persecuted. And even in this church at Philadelphia, even in this place where everything seems like it's going well, at least as far as the church is concerned, there are some problems they have to deal with. There's somebody there, and whether this is figurative, whether there's actual Jews there, people that are still trying to follow the law of Moses, and the persecution is coming from them, or whether this is somebody else that Jesus just refers to that way, I don't know for sure. The point is, though, there's persecution there. There's problems there. The church at Philadelphia is not faithful because there are no issues. They're faithful in spite of those issues that they face. All of us have problems. All of us have struggles. And I suppose it's part of human nature for me to think that my problems are worse than yours. Or for you to think that nobody has it as bad as you. Now, first of all, I think we make a mistake when we begin to compare our problems to one to another. I think really, especially when we get down and we start thinking about how bad we have it, and again, that's just part of human nature. I suppose everybody gets down at times. The one we need to be comparing our problems to is Jesus, not one another. And when I start thinking about what he did for me, suddenly my problems and my issues aren't such a big deal anymore. That's why the church at Philadelphia is successful. Not because they have no problems. Not because they don't face persecution. But they push on. They persevere. They keep on keeping on, even in their problems and their struggles. And Jesus promises that even in the midst of those problems and struggles, he's going to bless them. Now, what exactly this means when he says, those who are of the synagogue of Satan, I'm going to cause them to come and worship at your feet. I think that's figurative language for something. I don't obviously believe, first of all, I don't believe it's right to let somebody worship us. So I don't think that's what Jesus, I think it's using figurative language just like most of Revelation. But the point is, he's promising blessing even in the midst of persecution. I often think about Psalm 23. And there's a lot of verses, there's only 6 verses in the psalm, but a lot of what David says in that psalm applies to what we're talking about this morning. You know, that's the psalm that we hear a lot of times at funerals. He begins by saying, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And he talks about how that he leads him in the green pastures and beside still waters and so on and so forth. Well, one of the things David says in verse 5, he says, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup runs over. David doesn't talk about God defeating his enemies, although certainly God has done that. We talked about when he defeated Goliath. But that's not what David talks about in this psalm. He says, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. And what he's talking about is, even though David has problems to deal with, even though he has enemies, in spite of those things, even in the midst of those things, God has blessed him. And I think that's the gist of what Jesus is telling the church in Philadelphia as well. There are problems, there's struggles, there's persecution, but even in all of that, if you keep my commandments, if you don't deny my name, I'm going to bless you. Now, whether that's talking about physical blessings or whether that refers to eternal blessings or spiritual blessings, I think it's probably both. We don't always know how it is that God works in our lives. We don't always know when things happen, what God's plan is or how he's blessing us or if it's necessarily even God that's doing it. But God does work in our lives and he does bless us. And that's what Jesus wants the church of Philadelphia to know. Even with all the things that they face, they're blessed. Also, there's coming a time when everybody's going to know the truth. When there won't be any more atheists, any more doubters. Everybody will know. Paul says in Philippians chapter 2 and verse 10 that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow, of those in heaven and of those on earth and of those under the earth. Now, ultimately, I think this is what Jesus has reference to when he says those who are of the synagogue of Satan, they're going to come and bow at your feet. I think really that's reference to the end of time. But there are times, even in the physical world, that things happen. I can't look at something, some plague or some natural disaster and say that that's God trying to accomplish some certain thing. I don't know. I don't have revelation. But I do know that in the past, he's used things like that to carry out his will. I think about, for example, the church in Jerusalem. God's intent was always for the church, for the gospel, to spread throughout the world. But they didn't do that at first. Now, it was always God's plan, too, for it to begin at Jerusalem. And there was a time when the church was only at Jerusalem, and that was by design. That's where it began. But God always intended for the gospel, for the church to spread out from there. But they didn't do that. What eventually made that happen was persecution. The beginning of Acts chapter 8, after the death of Stephen and the persecution of Saul of Tarsus, the church was scattered scattered from Jerusalem because of the persecution. But you know what happened because of that? The church didn't die. The church didn't even slow down. It wasn't even hindered. What happened was it exploded. In Acts chapter 8 and verse 4, the Bible says that those who were scattered went everywhere preaching. Even in the midst of that persecution, there was blessing. And the church grew everywhere throughout the world, and it was because of the persecution. Now, I don't believe God caused the persecution, but I do believe on that occasion He used persecution to make His will happen. And He can still do that in my life and in yours. Now, I'm not going to talk about specific situations because I just don't know. But I do know that He works in our lives. And Jesus has promised that He's going to bless these people. He's going to be with them even when they deal with these persecutions and problems. He says in verse 10, because you have kept my command to persevere, I also will keep you from the hour of trial which shall come upon the whole earth to test those who dwell on the earth. I believe really verse 10, he's explaining what he meant in verse 9. He told them in verse 9 that those who are of the synagogue of Satan are going to come and are going to worship at your feet. And I think that he's giving more detail about that. Again, I don't know exactly what he's talking about. I don't know if this is what this hour of trial is. And I don't think it really matters. Because like I said, all of us face trials. All of us have problems and struggles. But Jesus is promising that there's going to be a difference between the way His people suffer and the way the rest of the world suffers. You know, I think about the plagues of Egypt. I believe it starts with about the fourth one. Might be the fifth one. I don't remember. I think it was either the flies or the darkness. I can't remember which one. I'd have to go back and look at it. But starting with that certain plague, God made a difference between the Israelites and the Egyptians. And the plagues that came on Egypt only affected the Egyptians from that point on. The Israelites didn't suffer during those plagues. And God did that to show a difference, a distinction between His people and the people of the world. And I think that's kind of what Jesus is talking about. Now, obviously Christians suffer. And Jesus does not promise a life of ease because we're Christians. But He does say there's a difference, or there ought to be a difference, between the way the Christian suffers and the way the world suffers. And I believe that's really what Peter's talking about in 1 Peter chapter 3. You know, we read 1 Peter 3:15 where Peter says that we should be ready to give an answer or a defense of the hope that's within us. But in that context, Peter is talking about suffering. And what he's saying is the Christian suffers different than the world does. And he doesn't mean that the things the Christian faces is necessarily different than the world does. We face the same problems and the same trials and the same famines and the same diseases. The difference is, though, in the Christian's attitude, the Christian's response to those things. And what Peter's saying there is that people are going to notice that difference. They're going to ask you, why is your attitude different? And that's when we can tell them, because I have hope. Through Jesus, I know that this world is not home. I know that what's happening to me is not the end. And that's what Jesus is promising, I think, is that they're going to be blessed. It may not happen today. It may not happen tomorrow. It may not happen until the end of time when we're resurrected and go to be with Him. But the way the Christian suffers is different than the way the world suffers. Verse 11 of Revelation 3 says, "Behold, I'm coming quickly. Hold fast what you have, that no one may take your crown." Now, first of all, I want to talk a little bit about what he means when he says, "I'm coming quickly." Because here it is almost 2,000 years later and he hasn't come back. That's obviously kind of a relative term, first of all. You know, what I think of as something that might happen quickly is very different than a teenager or somebody that's even younger than that. My perspective on time is a little bit different. Well, obviously, God's perspective on time is even infinitely different than that. In fact, that's what Peter's talking about in, I believe it's 2 Peter 3, when he says that with God, a day is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as a day. His perspective on time is impossible for us to even understand. But what does Jesus mean when he says, I'm coming quickly? Well, there's at least two things that I think that implies. First of all, he's telling us that life is short. All of us are going to die, and whether you live to be 50, 60, 90, 100, life is still short. And it's coming sooner than you think. And it doesn't matter how long I live, it's going to happen sooner than I think. And so I think in that sense, Jesus says, I'm coming quickly. But also I think when he says I'm coming quickly, he means when I come back, it's going to be sudden. It's going to be unexpected. It's going to be like a thief in the night. He says, hold fast what you have. That's just, again, that's another way of saying keep on keeping on. Persevere. Keep doing what you're doing. Then he says that no one may take your crown. Now, wait a minute. He just said there's an open door. He said, I'm the one who opens the door and no one can shut it. We read from Romans chapter 8 when Paul says that there's nothing that can separate us from the love of God. How can somebody take your crown? What is he talking about there? Well, ultimately, people can only take our crown if we let them. But there's a couple passages in the book of Colossians that I want to notice briefly. First of all, in Colossians chapter 2 and verse 4, Paul says, Now this I say, lest anyone should deceive you with persuasive words. One of the ways that we can have our crown stolen is we can be deceived. And unfortunately, there's a lot of people out there that want to tell you all kinds of things. And sometimes it's because they believe it. Sometimes it's just because they're liars. But they want to tell you all kinds of things that the Bible don't teach. And Paul says we can be deceived by persuasive words. Then he says in verse 8 of Colossians 2, beware lest anyone cheat you through philosophy and empty deceit, according to the tradition of men, according to the basic principles of the world, and not according to Christ. There are people out there that want to cheat you. Just the other day, I'm always looking at Facebook Marketplace, and there was an ad, supposedly from Cabela's, and it said that they were I can't remember now how it was worded. They were breaking up their relationship with the company that makes Raven crossbows, and so to get rid of their overstock, they were giving them away. You just had to fill out a deal to enter to win, and you could win a Raven crossbow. And I thought, really? And so before I put any information in, I Googled it. Sure enough, it was a scam. Somebody's trying to steal your information. There was another deal a couple weeks ago where it came on there that there was some sporting goods company going out of business, and they were giving stuff away, and they just wanted $10 for shipping and handling. Well, I know what would happen. I give $10 shipping and handling. They would take my money, and I'm not getting nothing. There's all kinds of people out there that want to cheat you. Well, unfortunately, there's people that want to cheat you out of heaven. And Jesus says we can lose our crown. It won't be by force. It won't be because somebody's able to close the door, because that's not going to happen. Jesus says the door's open. But we can be deceived and we can be cheated. We've got to be careful. We've got to persevere. We've got to hold fast to what we know. In verse 12 of Revelation 3, he says, he who overcomes. So it's possible to overcome. Not everybody's going to overcome, but it is possible. He who overcomes, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God, and he shall go out no more. I will write on him the name of my God, the name of the city of my God, the new Jerusalem, which comes down out of heaven from my God. And I will write on him my new name. My time's gone. But Jesus, again, is emphasizing what we have can have in him. But it's up to me and it's up to you. The work's been done. The door's open. But I have to overcome. He says in verse 13, he who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. What I believe that means is, that's one of the ways that Jesus says the choice is yours. You've got to decide. Are you going to hear? Or are you going to turn a deaf ear? I've got to make that decision. The door's open. Jesus came. He died. He was resurrected. He ascended into heaven. He did everything that's necessary to make it possible for me to go to heaven. For me to have an abundant entrance into that everlasting kingdom. But it's up to me. Am I going to hear and obey? Or am I going to turn a deaf ear? If you're here this morning and you've never obeyed the gospel, you're still on the outside. You ain't walked through the door yet. If you believe in Jesus, you're willing to devote your life to Him, and that's really what repentance is. It just means to turn. You turn away from sin, away from whatever you've been doing, and you turn to follow Jesus. And if you're willing to do that, you're willing to confess Him before men, you're willing to submit to Him in baptism, Jesus will save you. Paul promises in Galatians chapter 3 and verse 27, he says, as many of you as were baptized into Christ have put on Christ. If you're here and you've never done that, we would love to assist you.